Welcome to Financial Repression Authority's Roundtable Insight, where the best fund managers, economists, and industry leaders discuss the key investment issues and challenges in the current macroeconomic environment.
Hi, welcome to FRA's Roundtable Insight. This is Richard Benuli. Today we have Charles Hugh Smith. He's an author, leading global finance blogger, and philosopher. He's the author of several books on our economy and society, including A Radically Beneficial World, Automation, Technology, and Creating Jobs for All, and also Resistance, Revolution, Liberation, a Model for Positive Change, and also The Nearly Free University in the Emerging Economy. And most recently, a book called Pathfinding Our Destiny, Preventing the Final Fall of Our Democratic Republic. His blog of twominds.com is one of CNBC's top alternative finance sites. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you. Always a pleasure, Richard.
Great. And I thought we'd do a part two to what we did last time, if we call that part one on millennial challenges. So, where are the jobs? What are the challenges surrounding jobs for millennials, affordable housing, and just the overall livability, quality of life?
Yeah, I think this is a great topic, and I think just as a general starting context, I think what a lot of mainstream commentators don't understand is the economy we have today is just completely different than the one that existed 10 or 20 years ago. I mean, and yet everybody brings the same sort of mentality and value systems and expectations from an economy that really, in large ways, doesn't even exist anymore.
Exactly. And from that, it sort of creates its own challenges. The whole housing urban context, the cost structure is different from previous generations. And we're not going back to the 80s or 90s. This is navigating through a world of insecurity and costs, as it's going to be very challenging.
Yes, and so you've assembled some topics here that from feedback from listeners. So I'll let you take the lead.
Sure, let's delve right in. So one question is, what are the types of businesses that millennials can do remotely and globally? So for everybody's background, the last time we talked about doing work perhaps remotely, whether that means within a larger city or outside of the city limits. There's also global perspective. You've got a global economy out there, all kinds of jobs in newly developing economies like Burma, Myanmar, where any type of business that generally works in the developed world will work there very likely successfully, off the get-go. So lots of things happening on the economy, but what are your thoughts on that? The types of businesses that millennials can do either remotely or globally.
Yeah, that's a great topic, Richard. And I think we may want to speak to the idea that certainly any kind of digital work, like creative work, like advertising, marketing, product design, these kinds of things can very easily be done anywhere on Earth with an internet connection. But even in things like, say, starting a cafe or a brew pub, or something that was in the physical real world, there's opportunities there that are either global or perhaps opportunities that in markets that are underserved. In other words, like the globally, as we all know, urbanization has been just galloping, right? I mean, for decades. Tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people have been moving to very large urban centers, and in a lot of cases, like you mentioned in our conversation before we recorded. I mean, Berlin, London, San Francisco, Central New York, Atlanta. There's a lot of places where this intense urbanization has made housing unaffordable for most people, for everybody that didn't buy 20 years ago. And it's also made it extremely expensive to start a real world business. And so I think like if you're doing a digital work, like in terms of design, finance, etc., it's pretty obvious you can live pretty much anywhere. And so then your choice is what time zone is maybe easiest for you. But beyond that constraint, you can really work anywhere from like Zurich to Shanghai. But there's also opportunities for millennials in the real world, and then so that leads to the whole thing of, well, where are what markets are underserved and what markets are overserved, if you will, where they're so saturated that the expenses are so crazy that you really can't. It's very difficult to make a going concern in a very expensive city, with a new brew pub or something like that. That if you went to an underserved market, not only are costs cheaper, but there might be a much greater demand because there's simply not the same saturation in the market.
Yeah, exactly. And this goes along with a couple of questions from a very good friend of mine who asked, what is the future professions for millennials, like in terms of jobs? And does it make sense to invest? Can you invest money in a startup? In terms of a startup business, does that make sense? Or what is the best way to do that? Your thoughts on those two questions?
Yeah, those are great. Those are great questions. And, we've seen a lot of very large companies go IPO, initial public offerings recently, and WeWork, which actually was is a company that's tried to service this distributed work kind of economy where you'd be able to have a small cubicle or share space with other people and not have to pay an entire office yourself. That IPO kind of blew up, right? Because the numbers just didn't work out. It wasn't profitable. And so that's of course the danger with any startup, and is that there really has to be a track toward profitability that's not just fantasy, and that's a tough calculation to make, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the other context that because I do live part-time in the Bay Area of California, I think the other kind of context here is the digital world to a large degree has been built out. In other words, if we look at the internet starting in the late 80s, say, and then reaching sort of boost phase in the 90s, then mobile telephony with the iPhone, then mobile telephony came up, and then there was this huge expansion of opportunity from the merging of the internet and mobile telephony. And to a large degree, I'm afraid that's been completed. There's just not the same opportunities within, say, mobile apps and that kind of thing. That's all been done. And the large, you look at the huge platforms that have already kind of taken over their spaces. It's really hard to say, oh, we're going to get another Facebook or another Twitter or another Google, or it's like, no, there's only room for one of those on the planet. So therefore my thinking is, rather than look for startups that are claiming some sort of new digital territory that's unexplored, I think that's kind of very difficult to do. But startups that are serving existing platforms or serving some underserved market, yeah, on a smaller scale, there are definitely those opportunities. How do you invest in those? Well, that's a whole other topic, right? But in terms of professions, as I've said before in previous programs, my sense is you want multiple skill sets. You don't want to be a specialist. If you're going to be a surgeon, fine, But if you're going to be a sort of digital worker, then I think you're best served by having a skill set that's really flexible, so that we don't have to correctly predict what markets are hot 5 years from now or 10 years from now. You know that your skill set's going to be flexible, and so what's sort of enduring in skill sets are, of course, project management, right? In other words, managing people, managing progress. Even with AI and robotics, you need people to manage other people and to get the project, to put all the pieces together to get the project progressing, right? And then you still need some, statistical or math skills, software skills, just to be able to work with platforms and technology and other people using these skills. So if you can put together 2 or 3 kind of complementary skill sets based on experience, then those are really hard to automate. Everybody says, oh yeah, everything's going to get automated. And it's all like, well, has anybody actually managed like a cafe staff? I don't think some kind of like little robotic app is going to actually be any good at managing people. People want an interface, and you need experience. You can't just follow some simple rules. So those are my kind of general guidelines. I mean, what would you say about the professions of the future?
Okay, so yeah, I would say you mentioned like project management. Some things can be outsourced, like in the IT profession. It's outsourced to India or Morocco, but the areas where it is difficult to outsource is multidisciplinary. So what I mean by that is, if you combine some type of role that involves IT, technology plus legal aspects, some kind of legal knowledge or legal issues, regulations as well involved, and just overall maybe government policy or other aspects where there's knowledge expertise that's required in each of those. That's very difficult to outsource because the nature of it, I mean, it's difficult to find people enough that are good just in one of those areas. But when you combine everything together, those type of jobs are very, very high value and are retaining their high pay, in the developed world. So that's one point I'd like to make. Another is the whole movement on the applications to the blockchain economy. So taking what's happening in the economy and translating it into blockchain-based applications. So how is this process done? How is this service made? How is that manufacturing done? And just doing a mapping of that into blockchain-based, type of processes and applications and the way it's approached. So a lot of work is going to be done in that area. And right now, blockchain, of course, is being applied to currencies like cryptocurrencies, but that's just one of many, applications that blockchain has. So it's the entire economy. There are certain applications that still are being developed. I see that here, for example, here in Toronto, I use an application called Ritual in fact, I used it today for lunch. So I go on my app, on my cell phone, and I hit Ritual, and then I select the restaurant. In this case, it was named IQ. And so I ordered some healthy meal from IQ via Ritual, and you pay for it online. It tells you how many minutes your order will be ready to pick up. So, from your office or wherever you're working from, you can pick it up right at the exact time and bring it back to your office. Or in this case today, I was working out of a cafe. So, so that's what I did today. But yeah, so Ritual is an example. And then there's also, I mean, like Handyman, for example, the whole idea of fixing things is a good application that can actually be applied to on a jurisdiction basis. So maybe the application already exists in your city, but in another city or another towns, it doesn't exist as yet. So the idea there being, doing an interface to all the plumbers, the electricians, HVAC type of expertise, people that can fix, air conditioning units, heating, ventilation, all that. and then being able to get a quote on that through the application, setting someone up to come and do a site assessment, all that can be done through an app. So some jurisdictions have that, but some not. So you can take an existing application and apply it to a different jurisdiction. Develop that application to a different jurisdiction. So a lot of work there, to cover around the world, essentially.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Those are excellent ideas, Richard. And I would add, in the larger context, I think we talk about disintermediation, right? The dissolving or the obsoleting of entire layers of management and distribution, right? And if you look at these extremely expensive legacy systems, which I would identify as higher education, healthcare, and national defense, at least in the U.S. These are, multi-trillion-dollar industries, right, or sectors, and they're all just crying out for massive reorganization that would strip away basically useless costs, right?
Mhm.
And so, if someone were seeking a field to get into where you could really make a difference with either by joining a startup or working for an established player that's realizing they're going to have to change their whole business model. And so when you look at higher education, for example, I mean, I've already written a whole book about it, that it's really clear we don't need really expensive campuses and 14 layers of management. That really what we need is a very stripped down model, more like apprentice and master kind of model, even in academia. And then if you look at healthcare, at least in the US, you go, it's impossible to design a worse, more complicated and more wasteful system than healthcare in the US, right? So there's going to be a lot of opportunities for innovation in these spaces. And the same is true of national defense and intelligence, right? Like we just saw proof that 18 drones, which probably cost less than $100,000 total, were able to do an attack, and there may have been cruise missiles and so on as well, but nonetheless, a very low cost, low tech attack in Saudi Arabia did significant damage. That then you take a look at the F-35 fighter that costs like something like $350 million each. And so then you can say, well, there's clearly a lot of innovation that's going to happen in these really expensive, bloated, unaffordable sectors. So that's another thought.
Yeah, exactly. And also what's happening now, if you notice, even in Europe today, there was discussion about this whole modern monetary theory application to the economy by the governments and central banks. So they've exhausted the limits of what they can do monetary policy wise. Now they're looking at fiscal policy, fiscal stimulus, and that would be in the form of money printing instead of bolstering the banks. In this time, it would be looking at financing outright projects in energy, infrastructure, the environment. Now, I'm not sure if that's an efficient idea on what to do, because generally in the past governments have not been wise on selecting which technology or which project to do for different sectors of the economy. But nonetheless, those would represent jobs in energy, infrastructure, engineering, for example, like civil engineers, mechanical engineers, electrical engineers would be in high demand for all of this. And environmental systems, everybody is big now. The millennials are, even today, there was all kinds of strikes over here in Toronto in the streets for climate change. So it's on everybody's mind. So likely to be a lot of projects on addressing the challenges in the environment, what's happening, and that could mean even like water quality, air quality. We were just talking about China before we started talking how bad the air quality is there. So all of that, basically applying engineering sciences to environmental systems. Your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a great idea, Richard, because I should have included energy as that fourth multi-trillion-dollar industry that's just ripe for disintermediation and innovation disruption. And if we look at what the mainstream is wanting, in other words, everybody wants alternative energy and reduced burning of fossil fuels and so on. Well, all this sounds good, but the actual making it work does require a huge expense. You know, there's a huge investment to be made in energy storage systems, in revamping the delivery system. You know, because as a generality, we all know that alternative energy is intermittent, and people don't want intermittent power at their house and business. They want it to be 24/7. They don't even want to lose it for a minute. And this is going to require a lot of engineering to balance these different energy loads and even devise new ways of charging customers so that they're incentivized to use their electrical consumption when the alternative energy is cheap and flowing, as opposed to, like, doing your laundry at night or something. So there's a lot of innovation there, a lot of potential innovation that could cut a tremendous amount of expense and energy waste out of the system we have. And so, yeah, I totally agree. And speaking of energy and innovation, let's talk a little bit about urban planning, because a tremendous amount of our energy, I believe it's on the order of 40%, goes into, cooling and heating our buildings, and then another enormous percentage is on personal transport, right? Cars and so on. And so, if we could modify the way we work and where we live, we could do a huge, we could benefit. We could reduce energy consumption per capita, without necessarily requiring any new fancy technology.
Yeah, exactly. The job of the urban planner is great for a future profession for millennials, because it's right at the epicenter of all of what we're talking about in terms of pollution, addressing that, environmental systems, energy usage, infrastructure in terms of highways and housing, and the whole housing challenges as well. Because with urban planning, you've got the potential to advise relocating businesses to smaller or mid-sized cities, and therefore, where those businesses are could present much lower costs, for housing, rentals on condos, and so on and so forth. So the urban planner is very key into what we're talking about.
Yeah, and Richard, if we look at the broad context of, say, the post-World War II era, the last 50 or 60 years, there's been this intense concentration in the last couple decades into these urban cores with a lot of jobs, which would be the East Coast and West Coast in Canada and the US, and London in the UK, and Paris in France, and so on. And so, but that has raised the cost of housing to levels that a normal person, even if they're making a decent wage, can no longer afford to own their own home. And that's a problem. And you can't afford to have a family. And so I think that the millennial challenge is to find smaller cities where there's cultural variety, if you will, and diversity, and opportunities for serving underserved markets and digital work, but a much a lifestyle that doesn't involve, like, long killing commutes, huge, unbearable mortgages, like a couple of $1 million,
Yeah.
and unaffordable lifestyles that basically restrict having children, and so I wonder if this isn't the future, that we're going to move away from these urban cores for all the reasons we all know, and there's going to be a revitalization of, say, smaller cities that could be either suburban, in other words, within driving range of large cities, but eliminating the commute to the city center, and that you can just live your life and do your work in a suburban city, or within even an exurb, right, which is more or less an hour or two away from the city's center, and possibly even somewhat more remote cities that have excellent infrastructure. They could be located on a river, or they could have a university, or a hospital. They could have a lot of infrastructure there. And so that may be the future, that there's going to be a movement away from these unaffordable and increasingly unlivable cities. And so the challenge for millennials will be to find those places and be an early adopter, if you will. Like, those that get there first are going to get the cheapest real estate. They're going to have the choicest opportunities.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the size matters as well, because where there's too low of a population, that could present some other challenges. If you think of somebody going out in the middle of nowhere and getting 100 acres, but there's nobody to talk to, there's no place to party on Friday night, Saturday night, type of thing. So it could present psychological issues, social challenges. People may be lonely, or not feeling integrated, psychological problems. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. You don't want to be isolated. And I think that for the millennial generation, I think you want a town or a small city with active millennial political engagement.
Yes.
In other words, you want a young political power structure where people, where it's not just dominated by a bunch of old guys and gals who are kind of stuck in their ways and expect everything to be like it was in 1980. And so, and this is definitely a possibility. And in fact, even in my brother's remote village where he lives part time in France, the young people came in and instituted these changes to the village that were extremely beneficial, that helped revive the village and kept young families there, and therefore they could keep a school, and they could keep a post office, and they could keep a bakery, and all these things that make the difference between a village that dies and one that's thriving. And the same can be said about cities of like 25 to 35, 40,000, 50,000 people, right? If they're interested and willing to engage this kind of innovation and change, then those are places that people will want to live. And I'll give you a quick example of what's wrong with so many urban cities. I live part-time in Berkeley, California, which is well-known, progressive city, and but we have this. It's just right outside my door. The police are ticketing bicyclists for not coming to a complete stop, and the tickets are $200 to $300 each. So here's a city that's progressive, and we're supposedly encouraging people to ride bikes, and then you get a $300 ticket for not coming to a complete stop at an empty intersection.
Oh my God.
And yet, so this is not a unique situation, right? This is like urban life in so many overcrowded, horribly expensive, ridiculous commute, bloated bureaucracy. I mean, super high taxes. I mean, this is like a lot of urban places in America qualify. They're just not competently run, and they don't have good priorities. And so if you can find a smaller city, you can move the needle a lot easier than you can in some big urban complex, where there's vested interests, there's too much money at stake, and it's very hard to move the needle. Where if you're in a smaller city, hey, the politicians are actually going to, you can actually go and talk to them.
Right.
And you can actually get something done, like maybe make it easier to bicycle in your city.
Yeah. And another aspect of that is, why stop there? Why not think internationally? So if you can think of a business, or you start a business that you can do remotely within your city. So initially, maybe it was done downtown, but now you're able to do that type of work, that job, that business remotely in the suburb of that city as a first step. Then the you could just keep going, right? Why stop there? Why not take that job then internationally, so that, instead of going to a smaller city or a smaller town, you can now live and work in Barcelona or something, but be serving the residents of Dayton, Ohio, or San Francisco, California, from Barcelona. In terms of what you were doing in the suburbs there, as a step towards moving to remote-based work.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Richard. And you have a lot of international experience, and so you can speak to that. And I think if we look again at the very large context of the next 10 to 20 years, I'm convinced that one element of human life that's scarce is trust. And the other element that's becoming scarce is security. That your personal security, that you feel safe when you go out on the streets, but also that your own personal capital and income is secure. In other words, that you can count on it not being confiscated or totally disrupted by some mega factor that you don't control. So it's pretty easy to say that nations or regions that can offer trustworthy governance and infrastructure and offer some measure of security to whatever business you're engaged in, those are going to prosper and attract other talented people as well, because the cliche is capital goes where it's welcome and where it's treated well, and I think that's going to play out on a global scale going forward. So if you can be there early on, then you can be part of the process of making that even more attractive to other young people.
Yes, and also making or going to a place where not only capital but property rights are respected and form the basis and the foundation of the financial and economic system. So this brings us to another question, and that is the developments in Berlin and London on confiscatory housing. So just wanted to mention what's happening, the trend in those two cities in particular. So in London, there's reports of the idea of, if you're renting a condo from a landlord for some years, there apparently is a move now to allow that renter to buy the unit from the landlord without the landlord's consent at a rate which is lower than the market value. So just to give an example, which may not translate to what's exactly happening, but if you have £1 million house, £1 million, and that's the market value, perhaps you could buy that unit based on this law coming in, that would go maybe to 800,000, at a much lower, and the landlord cannot say no, this is not even the market rate. I can't do that. The landlord has no say. So that's the trend in London. And then in Berlin, the idea that if there's a housing complex, like an apartment where there's several units that are vacant. So we hear a lot about these reports of Chinese investors just buying condos, apartments, to park money or plan B's, investments in case of a credit crisis in China, which is happening now. They've invested a lot in developed markets of the world, US, Canada, Europe. So in those markets, and it's not just Chinese, but Persians, Russians as well, many others. So you see these vacant units, and now they're looking to say, well, we should confiscate this housing complex and convert it into low-income housing or migrant housing in Europe, as the case may be. So that is the trend in Berlin for what the thinking is happening. And that type of thinking could come to North America as well. Again, all of this is adverse to the economic and financial system, which has its bedrock on property rights and respecting capital. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, that is sobering, and it's like people are searching for a solution to the fact that housing in these highly desirable city centers is unaffordable, right? And there really isn't a good solution, because as you say, um, with the financial repression that we've often spoken about, the super rich have gotten even richer, and so they can buy a flat in London and one in Paris and one in Shanghai or wherever they want, and hold those off the market. And that is a problem that would really wasn't as prevalent before the age of central banker, omnipotence. But I think it also speaks to like the future of work itself. Like, and so we were discussing this before we started recording. So I'd like you to kind of speak to that. In other words, like, why do we have to live in a city center if we're doing a lot of work remotely, and if we're interfacing sort of regionally or within a city, then why can't we live in some place that's like half the price? So how about the nature of work? In other words, the sort of the daily processes of work have changed.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, a lot of this stems to the developments in technology and the ability to work on documentation and spreadsheets remotely. This has all changed the nature of work. And along with that, how do you market services and products, in terms of marketing, a creative type of social, based media services. It's basically the whole digital transformation of the economy is happening. And so this allows, given the internet as the infrastructure, the mechanism for this, if you overlay that with a transformation of the entire economy digitally towards blockchain-based technologies as well, it's just a massive change to the economy.
Yeah, and I mean we all know, those of us that work in this space, including you and myself. I mean, I never met my Spanish translators in Venezuela. I paid them with Bitcoin, and we just we chatted digitally and communicated digitally. And my editor in the U.S., I've never met her personally either. And she's been doing work for me for like a decade. So seems really natural and normal, but it's just so efficient. But you had a good point about sometimes there is a need for face-to-face work, and so I thought that was interesting. We're not like totally deleting the I don't know how to say whether it's whether you can call it a benefit or some sort of essential component in having occasional face-to-face meetings.
Yeah, absolutely. This ties into the whole corporate culture phenomenon where the advent of the millennials into the workforce has presented a lot of challenges because the millennials are generally more adept and comfortable in using the intranet than prior generations. Of course, they've tended to use more IM, instant messaging type technologies, email, WhatsApp, a lot of chat type of applications that basically allow them to sit in front of this screen, be it a laptop or a cell phone, and be shielded by potential challenging discussions that need really to happen in the corporate marketplace. Maybe there needs to be a discussion on a new strategy or decision making for next steps, new services, or what do we do now that this is a problem, this is an issue, how do we address it? A lot of those are very complex and cannot be easily addressed through a chat session or email. So there's definitely still a need for face-to-face meetings, or even the second form of just a phone call as well. So that, can't stress enough the importance of that in the corporate work environment.
Yeah, it's I think we're trying we're coming at it from several different angles, but we're really talking about a global change in the nature of work, in the nature of capital flows, and in urban planning. And all of these things are still early days. They're going to be playing out for the next couple decades. And so obviously those individuals who can find the early opportunities are going to have an easier time than people coming in later. And I was just corresponding with a millennial couple that moved from the Northeast in the U.S. to Austin, Texas, because they were sort of sick of the high taxes and sort of stagnation that they felt in the economy in the Northeast. And so they discovered that, of course, a couple hundred thousand other people have already got to Austin before them. And so Austin's actually, has over 500,000 people now, and it has congestion, and it has a lot of good things, but it's also suffering from popularity, right?
Yeah.
And so I mean, I'm just kind of commenting that, if you can be in the first wave of people entering a new town or city or suburb, then you're going to be able to snap up real estate at a lower price. You're going to be able to make use of the opportunities that are kind of unique to being in the first wave of people coming to a new market or a new town. So
yeah.
Yeah.
And actually, this leads into the last topic we can discuss today from questions on follow-ups by millennials to our part one, and that is on government debt as far as the pension crisis is concerned. So you touched upon that just now by saying, you've got this high cost structure, this taxes, local taxes, property taxes, and you've written a lot about this in your blog. And that is the idea that the whole cost of living, right, is so high. You've got all these taxes that don't go lower, insurance costs that don't go lower, food costs that don't go lower. And so it just forces a certain minimum level of compensation, right, to be able to keep the whole system going. But given the advent of technology and how it's driving, costs down, we have the global labor arbitrage as well. It's just such a challenge to keep up, with the demands of this high cost structure to a society. And this ties in with the whole pension crisis. So it's unfolding now as we speak in places like Chicago, Illinois, state of Illinois, where you're already seeing a brain drain and wealth drain of millennials getting out because it's just too much to address. Property taxes are going through the roof. So this is a big problem that needs to be addressed, namely the level of government debt, the unsustainability of government pensions, and how it's all tied together in this overall high cost of living structure. Your thoughts?
Yeah, no, it's a terrific problem, and I think I would contextualize it this way: there is a huge asymmetry between the generations, right? That the baby boomers who are now retiring en masse have been promised, in many cases, and certainly in the public sector, extremely generous pensions and benefits. And the healthcare system being broken in the U.S., the costs are skyrocketing for pensioners who have been promised Medicare or some other healthcare benefit. And so these are just crushing costs. There's just no way that this can be sustained, and so this is a generational problem, because when the baby boomers, of whom I'm one, when we were entering the workforce and in our 30s, things were still affordable. In other words, we weren't having to sacrifice having a family or owning a house in order to pay taxes. It was all, we paid our taxes and our Social Security and Medicare and so on, but it wasn't the crushing burden that's now being placed on millennials. And so I don't know quite how to say this politely, but it seems insane to me. It seems like a really negative choice to stay in a place with super high taxes that are only going to be going up as all the pensioners have this tremendous political power and are going to insist that all the promises made in previous decades are going to be that they're going to hold the taxpayer to it. And it's all like, at some point that system's going to break down into political disorder, and discord, because it's simply not possible, for the younger generation to be able to afford families and houses and pay the skyrocketing taxes that are going to be charged to make these pension promises. And so it'd be better to leave and go to a place that has a lower cost structure or a more rational or affordable or sustainable cost structure, and be able to afford a house and a family.
Wow, great insight. And you've written a lot on this in your blog, of2minds.com, in terms of like all the aspects of what we've just discussed. Charles, how can our readers and listeners learn more about your work in addition to the blog site?
Yeah, please visit of2minds.com, and there's sample chapters of my books and a bunch of archives for free. So please visit me there and check out my free work.
Great. Thank you very much, Charles. We'll do it again.
Okay. Thank you, Richard.
The FRA Roundtable Insight Show is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered as a solicitation or offer to purchase or sell any securities. The investments, investment strategies, and investment philosophies discussed or presented on the show each involve their own unique risk factors which are not discussed on the show. Any discussions among the panel participants or responses to listener inquiries are based on the personal opinions of the panel participants and do not take into consideration the listener's suitability, objectives, or risk tolerance. Please be advised that you invest or speculate at your own risk.